In this video, I will show you how I add bias binding to a bag with a gusset. The first thing I do is switch out my standard presser foot for this vertical needle presser foot, sometimes also called a zipper foot. This allows me to get the needle very close to my project without the foot getting in the way. Before you begin, do yourself a favor and check your bobbin. There's nothing more frustrating to sew a large portion of a bag only to find out that your bobbin was empty and you lost that game of bobbin chicken. This is the bag that I will be adding the bias binding to. As you can see, I have already stitched the front and rear panels to the gusset, and I do so with the flat part on the bed of my machine, and I squish the gusset side down so that I can stitch those pieces together. I will be using this 2 1/4 inch wide bias binding that is folded in half. I will link the video below that shows you how to make this continuous bias binding. And we will begin by clipping off the ends so we have a nice straight edge to start with. As I mentioned before, I like to do all of my stitching with the flat panel side down on my machine bed. So in this step, I'm going to clip the bias binding on that flat side. So I'll place the clips so that the flat side of the clips are towards the panel and the curved side are towards the gusset. I push the clips down as far as I can to hold the bias binding in place so that I don't get any folds or creases when I'm stitching from the other side. I like to use a lot of clips, but you don't have to. Use however many you feel comfortable with. You will want to leave a gap of several inches between your starting and ending points, making sure you backstitch at both sides. This way we can join the loose ends of the bias binding and then go back and do that final stitch. Now I'm going to sew the clipped areas of the binding into place. For this particular bag, I already have 2 seams visible here. The 1/8 inch seam is where I stitch the interior and exterior panels together, and the 1/4 inch seam is where I assembled the bag, where I stitched the gusset to the panel. You want to sew the binding on just inside your construction line. So for this one, it will be a scant 1/4 inch seam, just above this one right here. As you begin to sew the binding on, make sure to backstitch at the start. Take your time on the curves, making sure that the binding is flat and not folded. I often hand crank through these areas. And now I've reached a bulky portion, so I'm going to use my fork as a hump jumper to get over this part where the D-ring is attached. Now I'm sewing back down off of the bulk, so I'm going to use my fork on the front and I'm going to sew in between the prongs, and that will help keep the presser foot level. I have sped this video up quite a bit, but take your time here, make sure that everything is flat and level and not folded, and you'll be surprised at how much you can squish and manipulate that gusset so that you can get a good straight or curved stitch line. And don't forget to backstitch at the end. And now you want to take the time to inspect your binding, make sure it's all caught and smooth, especially on the corners. And here you can see the seam line where I stitch it right above the 1/4 inch construction seam. Everything looks good, and for the final stitch we will fold this over and stitch that right there, but first we have to close up this gap right here. There's many different ways you can do this. Since this area really isn't a stress point on the bag, and honestly it won't even be seen once it's turned right side out, I'm just going to overlap these a little bit and stitch them down. So I'll clip the one side off and leave enough space that I can fold the edge down so that there won't be raw material hanging out. So I'll fold that down a little bit and crease it, and then tuck the other side in and clip it in place and stitch it down with the same scant 1/4 inch seam allowance that we used previously. Make sure to backstitch at the start and end. And now I'm going to wrap the binding around to the gusset side and begin to clip it in place. You want to align the folded edge with the 1/4 inch seam line, or the construction seam line that you used on your bag, whatever that may be. Now that all of your binding is clipped into place, we'll take the project back to the machine, place the flat panel side down, and we're going to stitch from the gusset side with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, or 1/8 inch off of the folded edge of the binding you just wrapped around. Basically, you want to go just inside your construction lines as we did with the previous stitching. That way it doesn't affect the shape of your bag or your curves. As you are making your way around the project and removing the clips from the binding, you can hold the binding in place with a stiletto or carefully with your fingers, but watch out for the needle. You may need to use a hump jumper in order to overcome the elevation changes for thicker portions of your project. You will want to inspect your binding to make sure it has all been secured with the stitching. And you will want to repeat all steps on the other side as well. On the other side, in this corner, the binding folded over a little bit and was stitched down by mistake. So I will just unpick those few stitches and then re-stitch that corner. And now that the binding has been corrected on that corner, everything looks good, and I'll go ahead and finish up this side. And here's what the final product looks like with all of the binding attached to the inside of my bag. And now I will turn my bag right side out so that we can see the final finished product. I really like the shape and structure that binding gives to the outside of a bag. Don't worry if you made mistakes on your binding, because once you turn your bag right side out, it will be very difficult for anyone to spot any mistakes, because not much of the binding is visible unless you really dig and look for it. Thank you so much for watching my video. I hope you found the tips and tricks helpful.